Present. Window. All right. Hello, everyone. I think I'm sharing my screen and recording. So let's go ahead and get started. We've got 2 items on the agenda today. I think everything in the Istio in review is not something that we're actively discussing today, but if I'm wrong, please let me know. We can go ahead and get started with this first one. This one I added on behalf of someone else. I thought it was an interesting issue that could use some feedback from other folks. Oh, you actually joined. Awesome. Nice to have you here. So basically, I can give a summary of the issue. There's a lot more detail in here, but at the high level, a lot of tracing providers, and I'm sure this applies to metrics and logs as well, are consolidating around OpenTelemetry. But there may be a lot of configuration required to utilize them in OpenTelemetry. So in this example, it's Dynatrace, and they're saying that the configuration to configure Dynatrace with OTel and Istio could be something along these lines. Fairly complicated setup. You have to have, the URL, the port, the protocol headers with authentication, configure resource detectors, samplers, etc. Some of this stuff doesn't exist today, but the issue also talks about how they're working to add it to Envoy, so presumably it could exist in the future. So the question really here is, what do we do with this? There's kind of 2 obvious options. I'm sure there's some other ones as well. We could add a higher level provider that's instead of OpenTelemetry is like Dynatrace. Then it would just be the bare minimum that you need, your API token and your service. Or we can push users to do it the manual way. Now, the benefit is fairly obvious. This is a lot simpler and there's less to go wrong. You just need to configure exactly what you need. And behind the scenes, we can take care of the Dynatrace complexity. The downside is that, obviously, I don't think Dynatrace is the only one in the world with this problem. We could easily see, 10, 20, 30, 50. That would be quite astounding if that many people cared about Istio that much, but we could. Providers wanting to add these similar abstractions. So there's a risk of kind of bloat when we had kind of, to some extent, consolidated on OpenTelemetry as the one true API, and then we're kind of going back. So I'm a bit torn. I see both sides. So I want to bring it here and get some more opinions. Hopefully I summarized your issue appropriately. I probably should just let you summarize it, but I was in the leading the meeting mood, so.
No, thank you. You phrased it pretty well. And my voice is a bit weird today. I have a bit of a cold, so I appreciate it. Yes, the other thing that I didn't want to touch in the issue itself, because it's, can be looked at other ways, but one other thing that is also maybe can be considered or not considered, but the other thing is also like discoverability for us. Because, for example, if we have a customer and they say, I want to now start using Istio. Does Istio work with Dynatrace? And then they just Google or search for Istio OpenTelemetry Dynatrace, and they might end up in the page there, the page where the extension providers. And today there's a bunch of vendors there. There's all the other vendors are there. And then if, for example, we go with the route with the hotel one, which would work, but we wouldn't have any visibility there, even though we would have full support for everything. That can be solved by different ways, maybe editing the documentation somehow to list the vendors that are compatible with the hotel tracer, whatever. But that would be one thing that would be a significant disadvantage, let's say, compared to the ones that are already there.
Are we expecting that our users are? Oh, I'm sorry. There's hands raised. I'll raise my hand and wait in line.
No, go ahead, Mitch. Finish up.
Are we expecting that users are manually modifying that Istio operator file, or is it predominantly interacted with through Helm?
I don't really know exactly. I have to be honest. I don't really know exactly how this is being deployed right now. We have some ideas of making the deployment easier, for example, but I'm not sure if Helm will be added to that.
Well,
I
and
think it would
Joel,
be
that question was more for the Istio community. I understand that you
Right.
don't know how our users behave, more or less.
I think it's, I mean, I don't know, like, if Dynatrace users skew to one or the other, but regardless, it's pretty much the same. It's just a matter of whether you include these 3 lines or not. This part of the API is identical on both of them. So unless I'm missing something that doesn't seem to skew the problem too much, but I may just be missing the context that you're giving.
No, I guess what I'm thinking of is that what the fields that you have there look a lot like a template, right? You actually have just 2 values that the users need to provide, and then those values are applied to a template in order to get OTel working. And now I realize that this is not the mesh config. This is the Istio operator file. Okay, never mind.
But what it does is this passes through directly into the mesh config. So I think either you've inspired something in me, or I think you're right that we could have it be that users don't. So back in the day, we had values, and those translated into mesh config. Then we decided, no, we just want mesh config to be the user-facing API, and so we expose it directly. Like, this is a literal pass-through. We could, instead of putting it under mesh config and making a first-class new extension that Istio D is aware of, make it a higher-level thing in Istio operator Helm that then translates to these. So then it's only exposed in Helm, which is kind of nice. The downside is it kind of backs away from the stance that we did have, that mesh config is the user-facing API. Makes it more tricky.
So let me sorry for being the bad cop here, but that kind of defeats the whole purpose of adopting a standard in OpenTelemetry and attempting to standardize. I mean, if we start, every OpenTelemetry becomes another section and another specific thing that only the mesh operator, the one who manages Istio D, can actually configure. It completely defeats the whole purpose of OpenTelemetry, and it contradicts the whole model of OpenTelemetry, where you can deploy collectors, with different kinds. I mean, per node, per cluster, you can use external ones. You can have users, pick their own telemetry for their workload. It's in my opinion, it's a worse scenario, and it's just, kind of taking what was bad before and doubling down. I mean, it's kind of, especially when the OpenTelemetry standard defines its own standards for how to inject and how to configure external things. I mean, they have, if you use OpenTelemetry collector, for example, which is probably a good idea because you may want to read the logs, deploy per node, and then they have a configuration file exactly for this purpose, where OpenTelemetry collector can push to Dynatrace, push to other things. And they have an explicit configuration. So a user who's using Istio for sidecars is going to use this Istio operator. I mean, talk to the Istio D manager, tells them, please add this section because we use Dynatrace. They will restart Istio, redeploy, do whatever. But then all the non-Istio workloads and OpenTelemetry collector that probably collects data will have to use a completely different configuration that it's in a different syntax and does a different thing. I think it's a disaster for users because, again, we keep splitting the world into, if you're using a sidecar, then this config. If you're not using, then another config. And on top of that, everything here is standard stuff for Istio. I mean, the only thing special is API tokens that we unfortunately don't support right now in Istio for clusters. I mean, we have, you can define a service entry with all the TLS settings and everything else, but so far we don't have ability to inject the JOT token. That we can fix and provide a way for users to have parallel equivalent with what they would do if they didn't have Istio, basically. So I deploy OpenTelemetry collector, or I use an external service. It's a service entry because that's how we represent external services. That's my personal opinion. I mean, again, my primary concern here is not necessarily how we represent it in Istio, but how it interacts with OpenTelemetry collector, which is what I personally hope all users will use. So instead of having each application have the credential, because keep in mind, I mean, API token here, it will be distributed to each workload. So it's kind of pretty much wasted now because every single workload test and everything else will have access to the API token. You probably don't want this. OpenTelemetry collector having the API token. Yes, go ahead.
I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Your problem is not so much in the simplicity of condensing Dynatrace using some templating, but rather the configuration should not wind up in mesh config. It should be part of the telemetry API. Is that right?
It should. So there are multiple layers. Sorry, I'm sorry I go that long and mix too many things here. But first of all, the token, if you have an API token, you should not send it to all workloads. Doesn't matter how you are doing it, should never end up in all, because it should go to OpenTelemetry collector, which is, has a separate service account, and that's a security concern. Second, it should not be something that is centrally managed by the mesh admin. I mean, so it should not even be in the Helm. It should be either in a completely separate configuration that each workload can handle, which is the case for OpenTelemetry, or a service entry or something similar, not an install option. It's not our business to configure telemetry provider. It's OpenTelemetry business to configure providers. So there are many things that are wrong. I don't even know which one is worse than the other. Sorry.
I will say that the last part, though, that's not an issue with this proposal. It's an issue with the existing API, right?
No. Which API? Istio API or OpenTelemetry API?
The Istio one. I mean, this proposal is not centralizing the config. So
completely agree that Istio API is wrong. I'm saying OpenTelemetry. Let's not mess up Istio OpenTelemetry API file.
All right. There's lots of hands. Let's see. Oh, we have a queue. First class. Whitney is up first.
I just wanted to share that I think this issue is blocked until we really figure out what we want to do with our Istio provider model for telemetry providers specifically. Because as I was doing the work to drive telemetry API to beta, it's very clear that we aren't sure what's going to happen with OpenTelemetry and the future of our providers. But we don't want to get in the business of supporting a lot of different extensions, because that's sort of what OpenTelemetry covers. But also we are aware that there are some use cases that OpenTelemetry may not necessarily be the best for. So I honestly think that we should potentially backlog this until we put some work around intentional design around telemetry providers and how we really want to do that in the future using OpenTelemetry or not.
If you were to respond directly to that, you'd probably go now. If just unrelated, maybe Keith is up next. All right, I guess Keith.
Yeah, I'm persuaded by much of what has been said. So I think in the short term, my POV is probably not. I'm not persuaded by this proposal right now. I do think that this points to a greater discussion we need to have in Istio when it comes to contrib, in the model we want to engage in for these sorts of extensions, different providers, things like that. Excuse me for maybe pronouncing your name incorrectly, Joao. I'm not sure, but if Dynatrace wanted to, for example, I imagine a scenario in which Dynatrace had ownership over a contrib repo or contrib directory for the glue code or something like that. It wouldn't need to be centralized in Istio. Haven't thought super deep past the implementation. I think there would be some I'm sure there are complexities there, but I do think that the control over where this API token needs to live, collector versus workload to workload, how this gets applied, where the API token maps the well-known ports for your service. Again, this could be Dynatrace, Honeycomb, etc. Yeah, it's small. I agree. But I'm thinking, more about long-term ownership of it, and ways that we can enable. I consider Dynatrace, Honeycomb management providers as partners in our kind of providing this functionality to the users. And so, if we can provide a way for our partner ecosystem to be able to iterate independently of the folks here, I think that's probably better for everybody. But again, that's a longer term conversation.
I don't want to cut anybody, but I can reply to everything in the end. Or yeah.
I would just go ahead and reply now. It's easier than trying to remember
Okay.
10 things.
Yeah. Yeah. So for all the points that were brought up until now, yeah. So about the collector, so I can give you a little bit of background. So we have already today an extension or integration with Envoy. So we at Dynatrace we have what you know as an agent, I guess. So we offer agents and customers deploy on their infrastructure, and our agent detects everything, instruments everything. And we have an integration today with Envoy that uses the Envoy open tracing tracer provider in Envoy. But Envoy, I don't know if you're aware, but Envoy is deprecating that provider because the project is archived now. And that basically will break our integration and all of our customers. And Dynatrace does not support gRPC today, so it's a limitation. And what I have been working on until now, API was just merged, I think that's like last week, that I added an exporter to Envoy to export via HTTP. That was not possible until now. So you could only export via gRPC, the spans. So now with the new version of Envoy, you will be able to export to HTTP. And that basically unblocks our customers, because once open tracing is deprecated and removed from Envoy, then they can migrate to the full hotel, let's say, configuration in Envoy. And everything, let's say, will work. But about the collector, I fully agree. We even try to push that, because if customers were willing to deploy a collector, then we would. I worked for, I don't know, since July or June on this HTTP export in Envoy as part of my full-time job. And if customers were willing to have the collector and the infrastructure, we wouldn't have to do anything. They just use gRPC to Envoy and then HTTP to Dynatrace, like Costin mentioned. So that would all work. Everything will be configured in the collector. But unfortunately, that's not the reality. There's a significant number of customers that don't want to have a collector. They can't have a collector running, and they prefer to export everything directly to the Dynatrace API on the internet. And it will work with using the existing extension on Istio, like I showed there. This resource detector and the sampler is something new that I'm also working on, because it's quite limited today. You don't have enrichment on the data or anything, and I'm working on adding this there now. And the protocol and headers needs to be also added to Istio now, because, as I said, you can export via HTTP now, and if you export via HTTP, you can pass headers now, and yeah, this will be just an addition to the existing config in Istio for the hotel provider. So this would all work fine. We can give documentation to our customers. Hey, do this, do that. But yeah, as I explained in the description, there's unfortunately they do a lot of mistakes, and we get a lot of customer support requests everywhere in our GitHub repos, in hotel repos, in Slack, on Stack Overflow, via our official channels. And what I'm afraid is that if we go this way, the customers will start also opening issues on Istio now, because they think it's a problem with Istio. They think it's a problem with the extension. They don't know how it works. For example, the URL there in hotel, usually the URL has to be the base URL. So because the exporters append the v1/traces automatically, and they're used to it. But here they need to provide the full URL somehow. And then, for example, the token as well. Sometimes they put API without the dash. They make all kinds of mistakes, even though we have extensive documentation in our website. Yeah.
But Joe, I completely understand your point, but you'll have, there will be users who use hotel SDK directly. There will be users who use OpenTelemetry Collector. you have to handle those users as well. Why have 3 documentation, one for Istio, one for users using Hotel SDK, and one for users using Hotel instead of having just 2, which are the common ones. You cannot just support only Istio and only Envoy and nothing else. I mean, you still need the SDK and Hotel collector because some people will use them.
Yes, exactly. They will use the SDKs, and from the SDK, they export directly to the API as well.
I know, but we still need a configuration. So an application using the SDK will need a configuration. What I'm saying is that we don't want to define one for Istio only. If it's one defined in Hotel collector,
of course, yeah. And also what was something that I wanted to say as well is that it's Hotel defines the specification and all that. But it's not uncommon as well to have wrappers around the Hotel SDK because I don't know if you're familiar, but it's really complicated to set up. And we have a lot of customer requests I also see from other vendors, not just Dynatrace, also complaining that users find it's overly complicated to configure. It's a common problem that customers have all over the place. And it's not uncommon for vendors to create their own, let's say, wrappers around the Hotel SDK because they can make the configuration much easier for the customers. And the fact that there is a wrapper does not negate the fact that they can switch to another vendor quickly, right? Because they're still using Hotel. The applications are all instrumented with Hotel. They just need to stop using the vendor SDK and then switch to something else. Everything will work. It's just a shell around it to make configuration easier. So yeah. So, for example, Honeycomb has SDK wrappers. I think Lightstep also has SDK wrappers that you can configure the Hotel SDK with just one line. Say, configure Dynatrace, configure OpenTelemetry with Dynatrace, configure OpenTelemetry with Honeycomb, or something like that. And yeah, I get both sides, but I was also a backend developer for many years, and I would definitely rather pick the one that I just add the one line to configure than, I don't know, 20 lines or something.
So why don't you make this proposal to OpenTelemetry Forum and OpenTelemetry so they make it possible to configure it one line?
There's already,
SDK
of course, there's many works around this going on currently. There's a configuration, a special working group working on file-based configuration and so on. But it will take a while, right? It doesn't, not going to get solved tomorrow or in the upcoming year or something, unfortunately.
As soon as it's solved in OpenTelemetry, we can adopt it.
Go ahead, Lei.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to say that, for example, here is the endpoint, right? So if the endpoint, a single endpoint is not sufficient to support this Dynatrace, then probably a structure with all these details, for example, authentication tokens, but within the Istio telemetry API. I think the Kosti mentions that if the OpenTelemetry can have one single config, then it will be easier, but that may take time, right? So for example, if it's a file path to the configuration file, but that's not there yet. So what the structure I think makes sense is a provider name in the Istio telemetry API plus vendor specific structure containing all the implementation details like the token.
I feel like you came with a somewhat small, reasonable proposal and have got caught up in big project with many people issues, which is unfortunately a common, probably necessary and probably good thing for projects like Istio and Kubernetes. So thanks for for bearing with us and whatnot. I do want to make sure that at the very least, like we had a lot of discussions, a lot of points, that you have some concrete action items moving forward. It sounded to me like there was a reasonable amount of consensus that we don't want to do this as proposed right now while we're still figuring some things out. At the very least, though, I think what you can do is, I maybe not speaking for everyone here, but I think it would be perfectly reasonable for you and any other vendor to add a page on Istio docs on how to do this exactly. I know you probably have one on your own website, but that could help a bit with discoverability. If you haven't seen, we already have a page that's called integrations, and we have Prometheus, Cert Manager, Jaeger, whatever. No problem at all adding that there. The other thing would be the additions to the low-level API for things like doing HTTP versus gRPC, whatever else we need. Obviously, we'll review those on a case-by-case basis and the details and whatnot, but I don't see anything fundamentally opposed to exposing those. And probably the best way to do that would just be to submit a PR into the Istio API repo for those, and then we can discuss there. That should be pretty quick. So, probably no huge discussion needed there. We can discuss on the PR the details of how we surface it. The other thing I would say is if you do still feel like it's too much effort for users and they make mistakes and whatnot, you could have a small script or something that they put in the key or their account name or whatever, and it outputs the manifest they have to apply. Just a suggestion. I mean, that's obviously entirely up to you. One thing I will say is that you can, in Istio, provide multiple files. So like you could have a script that spits out this, and they could have their own, and then they can just pass both the files to the install, and it will do a deep merge. I'm not 100% sure how it handles the list. I'm pretty sure it will add it to the list as you would expect. So then they don't even need to like go copy and paste it into their config file, which they could somehow do wrong. Even though it should be pretty easy. I totally get the customers will do anything wrong. So just some ideas of easy ways that you can get a lot of the way there without having to get consensus on this whole proposal. So at least you have some step forward. You're muted, sorry.
Yes, yeah, no, thanks. For submitting the PR for the smaller things, I can totally do that. I guess that will be the way forward anyway.
Yeah, for some context too, in Istio, we're right now going in the telemetry API alpha to beta discussion. So there's a lot of discussions about what we want telemetry to look like in Istio. So it's probably it's a poor time for this discussion in the community because we're already discussing so many other things. So it's yeah. Keith has a good tweet as well. It's the unfortunate scenario that projects like us face. Cool. Anything else on this discussion before we move on?
Nope, for me, I'm good.
Cool. Thank you for bringing this up. This was, well, maybe not the outcome you desired exactly, but I think it was at least a good discussion. And yeah. I don't know if you went over.
Hi. Do you want me to talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, you put it on here, so whatever you want to do with it.
Sure. So there was a couple of issues that were raised about placement of Istio WG custom, because it appears to be placed very early in the chain in Istio, which causes issue for authentication being placed after it. I think the specific request was that there was some authentication could not provide attributes for custom authorization, which is odd because usually you do authentication before authorization. So as a follow-up, we wanted to organize the filters that we have in a sort of more principled way, rather than how it sort of evolved based on each individual API and then became a mesh of things. So we started looking at the entire sequence, and there's a general pattern of the purpose of the filters do, which are really broadly just two things that we do in Istio, which is application security, meaning all the authentication, authorization, and that we perform in Istio, and then the second step is the traffic management. And that's all the load balancing, all the traffic transformation, transcoding, and so on. And if you look at those broad phases, there is a certain conditions you have to follow in order that you don't create issues like we saw with the custom of Z being placed first. And that's the general principle, is that these phases have to follow in a certain order. You shouldn't be doing traffic manipulation before security, because that's a classical resource exhaustion attack vector. Unless you secure traffic, you shouldn't do any work on it. You shouldn't be doing routing before authorization, because if you're not sure about your route and you apply authorization, then you can reroute and bypass your whatever policy you wrote. And finally, telemetry should always be done last, because if you do it too early, then you will not capture the final traffic, and that will be mismatched at the backends. So if we follow those sequencing of phases, right, then we have to change the order of Istio filters. Can you scroll down to the final list? So if you organize all the filters based on the purpose, then this is the order that they should be following, and it's not the order that we have in the code. And there are two big problems there. First is the Istio custom authorization. It has to move towards authorization that we do local, away from the way it's placed now, which is pretty much the very first filter. So that's one problem. And the second problem is the course filter. So course is its origin filtering for the options methods. And right now it's placed very late in the chain, I think somewhere next to fault, which is incorrect, because first of all, it's a authentication filter. It's a policy filter. It shouldn't be within traffic management. And second, it should not precede JOT filter, because the browsers never send JOTs with course requests. So that causes all kinds of issues of special, policies in JOT and authorization to exclude options method, rather than just allow options method the course policy. Yeah, so those two problems, and the final problem is basically telemetry is all over the place, and that's not consistent, because we capture things at different places, so we don't report things consistently. So the proposal is just to move all telemetry into one group at the end of processing, and moreover, if they are not truly filters, just turn them into access loggers and proper extension points in Envoy rather than filters. So this is a general proposal. I think it's written as a PR, so you feel free to comment there. But the idea is that we will migrate Istio filter chain to this sequence, and that sequence will have to be consistent for the duration of the Istio, because this is really a specification for XDS that we should respect. Because changing any order here actually has visible impact, and it should be done lightly. So I just wanted to get some feedback, and before we do anything on this, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing. So very recently, I forget if it's in 120, which we haven't shipped, or 119, but we changed the order. It would be unfortunate to change the order twice back to back. I mean, it's unfortunate to change it at all, really. But if it is in 1.20, I can double check. It was a PR I sent. We should either do this in 1.20 or not, even though it's kind of late in the process, to reduce churn. So we should look into that. Obviously, we also need to decide whether we do want to do this, but if we're going to, we should try to avoid the number of times we change things.
Yeah, so I mean, as any safe migration, we have to provide escape flag. So we can backport it if we just use the flag in a different value. I think that's not a problem. Keith?
Yeah, really thankful for this doc. I think this is great. I like the general principles that are outlined here. I think they all make sense. I would be very interested, putting my my gateway API involvement hat on. I'd be very interested in seeing if there could be some consensus across data plane implementations on order. Granted, there's not necessarily capabilities that match across all the various data planes, but if we can get alignment on those principles, I think that would allow us to do some really cool things and you can create some standards around extensions, for example, when it comes to WASM or Lua. It will allow us to be able to have some, to write, for example, a gateway API or Gamma authorization policy resource and have some reasonable consistency across implementations on when that resource applies, since that is an open question currently, as I've been somewhat noodling on this. So I guess to turn this finally into a question rather than just a comment, do you foresee, I'll phrase it like this, how much of this do you think is Envoy specific rather than, or as opposed to general principles for proxying traffic and doing traffic routing and policy?
Those are not Envoy specific, those are general principles. So I did some research and with Google infrastructure, for example, follows generally this, but also somewhat deviates. It's a fair, I mean, we don't have many phases really, it's just 4. It's pretty easy to map most all proxies to those 4. When you go into finer detail, then it gets somewhat messy, and that's hard to resolve sometimes. But as a broad, just you do security before traffic management. That's pretty consistent, I think.
Yeah, agreed. That was my sense as well. I just wanted to check since you did the work. Again, really, really thankful for this.
Larry?
Yeah, so Quad, I just want to maybe confirm some corner cases. For example, if a telemetry filter is measuring the, for example, request received, and if the request, this filter is put at the end, for example, if the authentication failed or authorization failed, maybe the the connection is disconnected and it won't reach the telemetry filter, for example, to get the request received because it's simply rejected. I'm not sure such corner cases. You mentioned there are some messy cases. For example, in this case, maybe this filter should put at the beginning, right? Basically, provide the statistics of all the requests received. Some get denied, some get admitted.
Yeah. So I know what you're talking about. So yeah, that's why telemetry is not really filters. They should be done concurrently with request processing. So they should be always done at the end, regardless what filters do, and they should be done periodically for the long living. But so they're not really filters; they're done concurrently, and that's part of this proposal is to actually make them, access loggers which run concurrently. Does that make sense, or?
So I guess let me try to maybe rephrase what you're saying. So you are saying that this proposal already covers such corner cases. Essentially, the access log will always provide all the requests, right? Even if it's get denied, and so it's okay to put the telemetry field. Sorry, telemetry. I think this proposal is about the placement of a filter order, right? So you are saying it's okay to maybe put the telemetry filter at the end because the access log covers the corner case. Maybe.
Yeah. So let me explain a bit more. So if on this picture there is no Istio stats, if you noticed, because I think Istio stats is not a filter; it's actually an access logger. It just was incorrectly classified as a filter, and we should change it to adopt a different interface that's more appropriate. But there are some filters that we cannot just get rid of at this point, like the WASM stats filter is a API now, so there is nothing we can do about it. It's just there, so we have to respect it. And if you do have a filter, you probably want to capture it at the end of request, because capturing it early is just also odd, right? I mean, you're going to be capturing a lot more things that are not even policy decided on.
I somehow feel it's specific to the purpose of that filter, right? So for example, Istio stats currently is a filter and the stack driver is a filter, but I think your proposals in future, it should be converted as some access logger interfaces. But let's imagine, I'm not sure this is a very, existing case, but what I'm saying is if you want to have some kind of telemetry filter to do some, statistic at the beginning, basically, for example, the traffic amount you received, for example, for checking the health of your service. Probably, I would think it makes sense to put that filter at the beginning because it is for raw traffic. Get denied or not is not its concern, right? It's just want to provide the statistic of all the traffic.
Oh, yeah, I agree with that. I mean, all of the authorization filters do emit telemetry attributes, so they will be. You can produce telemetry attributes anywhere in the chain. That's I agree. Yeah. And if it's just production, I think it's fair to put them anywhere where it makes sense. For something like gRPC stats, I think it makes more sense to put it at the end because if you do transcoding, you might want to capture the transcoded gRPC rather than the input JSON. Costin?
I think telemetry is wonderful, interesting, but I'm not worried about telemetry. I mean, access logs are pretty much clear, and whatever Envoy is using for access log is probably good. Security is the one that concerns me. I'm okay with 99% of what is here. Authorization, if we do it at the beginning, it has a risk that, well, first of all, we cannot use anything related with the transformed request if it's transformed. And it doesn't have access to some information that are probably useful. So I think the only change that I would make to this ordering is to add another, maybe if possible, something at the end of the after traffic management to do some authorization. And what I was thinking about, which is not covered in this proposal, is if we can do per route authorization. So if we can, some of the filters in Envoy can have per route override, which happen obviously after the route cell is selected and everything else. That will probably complement this proposal and will address my concerns because if we can also attach authorization per route, it implies that it happens obviously at the end after route is selected, and then that particular authorization can know which route was selected, whatever transformation happened, what host rewrites and everything else. But of course, authentication and all the other stuff, including the fact that authorization can do its own routing, it's okay for the HTTP connection manager ordering, but not now. But we need to address at some point how we do some authorization after route is selected. That's really my main concern, which can be addressed later.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to clarify. So the per route config is not affecting sequencing of configs at all in Envoy. It just changes the config. So if you put per route config, it doesn't really affect order. You just override
a question on that. So say I had auth Z like first, but it was a per route auth Z, and then I pick the route later on. How does that work?
Well, that's what I'm trying to prevent, is that if you change the route and then after you do of Z, then you should do another of Z, but since you can't do it in this model in Envoy, it's only one chain, you should avoid doing that. So all the routing should happen before you do any of Z. And we do routing based on JOT sometimes. That's why we want to put JOT authentication before authorization policy.
I guess I'm a bit confused because don't things like fault to some extent and gRPC web and stateful sessions and potentially some of the WASMs impact routing, which happen after the auth Z?
No, they just changed the So they are either load balancing or they change the data, the request itself.
I see.
Load balancing always happens after routing, so it's always last.
So routing can't be. Can a WASM plugin impact the routing?
WASM is sort of broken in that sense because you can change routing even in stats, which we don't stop, but you shouldn't. I think we just didn't lock it down to the reasonable extent. The biggest problems right now is JOT changing routing and authentication WASM changing routing. So as long as we put those early, I think we're fine with rerouting.
Isn't it really common for X.Z to change headers and then use those for routing?
We don't allow changing that. I checked. So it's not just enough to change headers. You have to explicitly tell Envoy to reroute, and we don't enable that.
With a clear route cache or whatever?
Yeah, it's not enabled right now.
I thought it was. Okay.
It probably should or might need to. I mean, that's a very important feature of X.Z that it can impact, can set headers impact routing. So I'm not sure the fact that it's not yet enabled is something that we want to make permanent and include. One related question is, if a user today is upgrading to the versions that has those changes, what will break? And the second, can we make those changes in ambient first or specific for ambient where there's expectations that different behavior will take place, different API surface, different behavior? Or are you confident that it will be 100% safe and no user when they upgrade will have to, have a security CV or some other problems?
Yeah, so I don't think it's going to be security CV, but it might have functional impact. So when you move course first, you allow course more often. So that just means your course policy will be respected first, rather than you having to write authorization policy explicitly allowing course. So it won't break anything. It just allows more course requests to be handled.
So I'm not worried about telemetry at all. I'm worried about a user, some traffic going to the wrong place, or security, not being applied as the user expect. And, I'm not saying CV in the sense that, buffer overflow, but just in the sense that user expects that some combination of JOT routing, and the APIs we currently support, suddenly having a different behavior and something that was previously denied becoming allowed. In a combination of different filters, different rules, different everything. If there is even a small risk of that, then we need to be extremely careful before making this change, because it will be users today expect that they can upgrade Istio and it will not break.
Yeah, but there is all workarounds for any of those issues, right? So the chance you're going to break someone, they have to use a combination of things together in a weird way. So there's always a chance of that. But I think the number of those folks is not that high. And we should provide them escape hatch via config.
But again, I upgrade Istio. I'm just, I'm used to, Helm update and update and nothing. I mean, that's a problem. I mean, we need to provide them analyzer. We need to provide them some way to because it's enough to have one production outage and the entire trust we built with the upgrade process will be gone.
Well, you have to use custom of Z to be affected, and you also have to use WASM to be affected. So the number of people who use both WASM authentication and custom of Z, that's the ones that are affected, and they actually want this change, as far as I understand. So they already do all kinds of workarounds to get around it, and I mean that just means they have to drop those workarounds. That's the impact, right?
Yeah.
I know there's other people using Envoy filter just to put course first. So they just need to.
I'm worried about the beta APIs, but I mean, if someone is using only the beta API, only the stable APIs, it's going to be at risk then probably we should do it only for ambient or be more careful. If it's WAS with alpha, it's, people who use WAS probably, envoy filter probably expect. That's like,
well, there's no other way to do it. Like there's no other solution to deploy Istio unless you deploy envoy filter that handles cores. So either we do this and they can stop using envoy filter, or they continue using envoy filter forever and never be, supported.
Yeah, I don't think that that's the right word. I mean, for ambient and for future. But my concern is how risky it is if we land it in. Yeah, sorry, John, you can.
Yeah, I was gonna ask kind of along the same lines as Costin. From my understanding, the two maybe points of controversy is where cores is and where x.z lands. Is that accurate? I mean, I know the rest may have changed in some small impact, but those don't seem concerning to me.
Yeah.
On those, yeah, okay. On those cores before OZ, it makes sense in a lot of cases. I don't know enough about how it's commonly used in other products, other load balancers, clients, whatever. Is it universally correct to always put it before OZ? Is it something that a user may want in some cases and not in other cases? And same thing for x.z. There was those discussions about flexibility for x.z. Did they need flexibility for it, or did they just need this? And in general, do we expect users to need flexibility or just this better placement?
Yeah, so the of x.z, right? So I think Kostin wanted to ask about the routing done. So if we ever do that, we should not be just flipping the flag. We should be adding a specific option to allow that. And if we do that, it should be placed early in the chain, like it is now. So I think there's a long-term impact is that the way it's done right now, it doesn't change routing. It just changes the sequence of when you deny. And generally, that's very limited impact unless you pass attributes between them. So it's safe. But once you start doing routing, then it's much more dangerous to move it around. So it's better to do it now before we flip that flag.
So what you are saying is that at some point, if we want x.z to be able to set headers and affect routing, we'll modify the beta authorization API, add another field saying x.z route headers, whatever, to enable this feature, and that opt-in will swap the x.z at the beginning or earlier.
Yeah, I think it will be called twice, basically. Once with that flag and one without that flag.
I see.
That's much more dangerous change, actually, than this. And that's why it's good that we didn't enable it, because we have time.
I mean, it's anything that is opt-in is not dangerous. What is super dangerous is I just upgrade with no configuration change and behavior is broken. So I'm not worried at all about anything that requires user to actually do an action and opt into a particular feature.
Yeah, we can run it as opt-in for a version. I don't expect any tests to break at all. I think we rarely exercise dependencies between filters. But it is a possibility because there's so many extension points that people relied on it, and we saw it many times. I mean, we used to flip orders even without warning. Even in the last version, I think we just flipped them, and it seems like it was okay. Which I think we should stop doing, to be honest. But before we should stop doing, we should pick a good order, and I think that's better. Well, Kostin, I mean, we already flipped it, as John said, without warning and without any opt-in. It's not like we do it.
I know, and that proves it doesn't prove that it was a good idea. I mean, it just means that we didn't review it enough or didn't do the due diligence and reduce risks. That's unfortunate, but
well, to be fair, change the order of something doesn't necessarily mean that we change the behavior. I mean, I have to double check exactly what we changed, but I think it was a no-op change when we changed it, whereas this we actually are intentionally changing the behavior, and in a small way, but
if it's, I mean, small, that's when we talk about security, small things can
no,
have
I
big
totally
effects.
understand. I'm not saying that the small things are a risk. I'm just saying.
Yeah. But are we? I mean, I think we have consensus that this is the correct order, and what is proposing is the right thing to do. The only issue we are discussing here is basically how we reduce risk and how we mitigate, unknowns. What are you very strongly against just adding a flag for this release and then turning on by default next one? So and telling users, hey, this next Istio release, please enable this in your canaries or whatever, see if it works, see if it breaks anything, and next release will make it default, which is pretty commonly done in Istio.
Well, nobody will do that if you do that. I mean, I'll experience that if you don't.
Then they will not complain to us. I mean, if you don't, we tell them to do it. If they don't do it, that's, I mean, what can we do? But at least we don't just change it underneath them with and tell them you cannot upgrade, or I don't know. I would feel better to give them a choice to do the right.
Right. I mean, strong agree we need to keep a compatibility flag. I just don't think it should be off by default.
In one release and then the other way around. We did it many, many times before.
Well, I mean, we can discuss it later, but we can have a flag that controls the order. I have no problem with. It's just unless you make it switch, it's just punting the problem, because I don't think people are actually going to try it out.
That's their problem. I mean, again, we cannot do anything about what people do. We can provide them an opportunity to test it and do the right thing. They cannot complain to us, basically. So if we tell them to do something and they don't do it, at least they cannot complain that they didn't have a chance to.
I get a lot more complaints about having this backported to like 119 or 118 than having it not enabled. So I would prefer this being enabled on all the versions if you could, because the order we have now is actually causing issues. It's not.
I know. I don't mind backporting it. I mean, again, not with the option to make it to opt in, basically. That's actually a very good thing for older version. I mean, if we backport it to 119, we should, backport and put a flag. Anyway, I don't feel very strongly. I'm okay with one without it.
Well, feel free to comment on the PR. I'll respond to comments there if you have more. Oh, Lei? Sure.
Yeah. So I have a question about the order of course, right? So it's placed before authorization. So this should be after authorization, right? Because this and also after routing, because this course is to send to HTTP server, right? Depends on, for example, host, depends on route. It depends on whether this, is allowed or not, right? Because, for example, if the auth and auth failed, this means even it doesn't need to reach the HTTP server. So that's only, quite concern I have for this order.
Course is not a normal request. It's a pre-flight request. It's just a check origin.
So it's a pre-flight request to check the HTTP server whether, for example, certain resources can be accessed or not. But that, I think it depends on, whether you are allowed to, access this server, and also depends on, the route to this server, right? Because after you route, you probably, for example, for certain job, if the identity is full, you go to this route. If identity is bar, you go to a different route. So
well, if browsers don't send JOT of course, never. It's actually specified that browsers should not send JOT. So you cannot even authenticate JOT requests usually, and that will definitely fail authorization. So if you follow that logic, then you'll never authorize any any course requests.
The concern I have is that just because the spec says that the clients shouldn't send credentials doesn't mean that we shouldn't allow authorization before CORS. It may, but to me, that's not enough evidence just based on that. And I don't know. I'm not a CORS expert. it very well could be the right answer. But I read that doc you sent, and it points in that direction, but to me, it's not conclusive. So it'd be useful to get a bit more feedback on what other proxies do, if there's guidance on this, etc.
But maybe course has changed since I last seen it, but generally it's not that critical for security in terms of, servers just send some headers and perform. It's not really intertwined so closely with security.
Yeah, I mean,
so
maybe
element.
The values you return in the headers are PII and you want to block them. I don't know. I mean, I think you're probably right. It's probably fine, but I'm not 100% convinced yet. And it would.
Yeah, if you look at the course APIs in other servers, I mean, Cloudflare and a lot of other places, it's not that, complicated.
Yeah, I mean, if you did like MTLS, for example, you would certainly deny them before they got to cores, for example. But I guess maybe you can't even do MTLS for cores. I'm not sure about that. But it would still be denied by lack of client cert. So I don't know.
I think courses like telemetry, it's really not that critical.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
Let's go to the ambient meeting.
We can follow up on this as needed.